Thank you for listening to A Glimpse of the Kingdom. A Glimpse of the Kingdom can remain free because of generous donors like you. If you'd like to donate, feel free to do so online, or you can send payments through Facebook Messenger. Don't forget to tell your friends about it so that they can enjoy this ministry as well. Be sure to subscribe so that you don't miss any podcasts.
You can listen to my daddy every single day, like in the gym, in the car, or just at home. Glimpse of the Kingdom is awesome!
Hello, thank you for listening to A Glimpse of the Kingdom. I am David Pendergrass. I've received several questions recently, and I want to go through them and do my best to give you some short, succinct answers on these, as short as I can for a podcast. Here we go. First question is, what does IHS on crosses mean? IHS on crosses mean. If you're ever seen a sign, or of course if you've been to Roman Catholic Church and Orthodox churches, you oftentimes see it looks like IHS with the cross, and maybe sometimes they're cross-stitched or ironed on or sewn in, and sometimes there's gold-looking, I don't know the exact word to use. The point is, it looks like IHS. You'll see it as a sacred symbol. It actually is not IHS. The answer is it is not IHS. It is Greek. It is iota eta sigma, and that is the first three letters of the word Jesus, which of course is Jesus. Now, Jesus, if you didn't know this, if you do, then sorry, that's the boring part to the podcast. Jesus is an English way of saying a Latin word, which is actually based on the Greek word Iesus, which is based on a Hebrew word in Aramaic for Yeshua. So they all mean the same thing. Yeshua is Hebrew, and we would say the word Joshua or Joshua is straight from the Hebrew if we transliterated it. But Yeshua, the Greeks didn't say Yeshua because Greeks didn't speak Hebrew. And the way they had Yeshua come through the Greek language was Iesus. And then, of course, later on, the Latin Jesus, and Jesus became Jesus because there's no J in Latin, eventually corruption of language anyway. So anyway, IHS is really iota, eta, sigma, the first three letters of the Greekized form of the Hebrew name, Yeshua. And Yeshua, of course, means or is short for Yahweh. It means Yeshua means Yahweh saves, or God is salvation, or Yahweh saves, God saves, either one of them. Some people don't know that, and so I'm not sure when it exactly happened, but for a long time, certain people think IHS really is an acronym for IHS, and they've made up all kinds of things like the Latin Iesus hominum salvator, which means Jesus, the Savior of men, but that's not what it means. It actually is from the Greek. And in the Greek, like I just said, Jesus, the first three letters of Jesus for Jesus. A little side note or footnote as well is that in the ancient world, in our manuscript traditions, manuscripts are handwritten copies of the earliest fragments and sometimes entire documents of any ancient document. Manuscript literally means handwritten. Manus from Latin for hand, and scripte for written, so handwritten. Anything handwritten, and that's anything which is a long time before the printing press came around. And our most ancient forms of most of our very, very ancient manuscripts of the New Testament practice a kind of shorthand of something that we eventually garnered the name of nomina sacra, the sacred names. And what it was is they would take these common names like Jesus and God and Spirit and other things, and there's about a half a dozen to up to a dozen, depending on the manuscript tradition, where they would shorten the word. They would take the first two or three letters of it and then write a straight line above it. And there's different theories at the time of why they did that, and some said maybe because they didn't want to pronounce the name, it was too sacred. That's probably not the reason I'm just saving time here, but that's probably not the reason. My own view, and a lot of scholars, but my own view is that it was just a shorthand because the name appeared so often. But that there's still some questions to that hypothesis, if that really makes the most sense of the data, but That is my personal view. But anyway, the point is there's a long tradition on the most ancient manuscripts we have, on some of these ancient manuscript traditions, of using the nomina sacra, these sacred names using the first 2 or 3 letters of the Greek word. And this is an example of it. So this, what looks like IHS, Iota, Eta, Sigma, these are the kinds of things they would have done in the manuscript tradition. They would have just put these first 3 letters and put a straight line above it. It's a long tradition of doing that. So it's not weird to see insignia now that has these 3 letters or 2 letters and so forth. Another example of using the first part of a word to represent the entire word is in the word Xmas. Xmas. X is not X. It's really not. It looks like our X because we get our letter X in the American alphabet, the American English alphabet, because it comes from the Greek chi. Chi, it's actually pronounced k, or key, is what we call that X-looking symbol. And so it's not Xmas, it's actually chemus. And that's because that's the first letter of the word Christos. Christos, of course, is the Greek way of saying someone who is anointed. It's an anointed one. The Hebrew word of saying a person who is anointed or literally rubbed with oil, is Meshiach. We get the English word Messiah from Meshiach. The Greeks didn't speak Hebrew, they spoke Greek, and so they used a different word, Christos, which means one who's anointed with oil, or you can say Messiah. And of course, the English corruption of that is Christ. So Christ comes from Christos. Christos means anointed one, and that's why that it looks like an X is used. So Christmas, and if we put that Christ back in Christmas, Xmas is not an attempt by Satanists or atheists to get Christ out of Christmas. It's really not an X, it's the first letter of the word Christ. You might not like that. You might say, no, I still don't like it. When Christmas shouldn't have that key, it should say Christmas. Okay, that's fine. You can, if that's a pet peeve of yours, it sure can be. I know people who know the explanation of why it is the key, a shorthand for Christ and Christmas, and they still don't like it. Well, you don't have to like it if you don't want, but that is the origin of it. That is the etymology of the word Xmas. It really is shorthand for Christmas, for the key. So anyway, so IHS is not IHS, X is not X in Christmas. It really is from the Greek. Another question. What happened to the Ark of the Covenant? Well, as everyone knows who has seen Indiana Jones and the Lost Ark, this has been settled for a long time. It's actually in Area 51 in Nevada. And I guess that's kind of funny. I don't know if that's that funny. I can't lead up to a big joke on that. The Ark of the Covenant, first off, what is it? A lot of people don't know the Ark of the Covenant is. Ark of the Covenant. And it was called that sometimes in the Old Testament. It was often called the Ark of the Covenant of God. And a couple times it had a much longer name. I can't now in front of me. The Ark of the Covenant of God, of the one who, of the Ark, the Israel, the tribe of Israel. It was a long title. But the Ark was the major religious symbol of Judaism before the monarchy. Before the monarchy, if you're not familiar with your monarchical data of Israelite history, there were 3 and only 3 kings. Can you name them? I don't know if I had to get paid royalty if I sing that song or not. 3 kings. The first one was Shaul, Saul, which means asked for or prayed for by God. That is someone asked God to have a baby, as the idea. Anyway, and then of course after Shaul or Saul was David. Dawid in Hebrew means beloved by God, and then his son Solomon, who had a bunch of women. After that, after Solomon died, it did not go to an heir. The kingdom was divided and split, in Israel in the north, and down the south was Judah. Anyway, before there was a monarchy, the religious symbol, before there was a temple, particularly, there was the Ark of the Covenant. Now, the Hebrew word for ark, you can use ark, but to make it we don't use the word ark anymore. But because of powerful tradition, it's going to be continued called ark, I'm sure. The ark in Hebrew should be translated box, and a better American English translation would be chest. Chest. So a box doesn't have to be filled, it's just a box. But when we use the word chest, we usually means it is made. It's a box made to be stuffed or filled or put something in it, like a chest of drawers and so forth, or a chest with you put blankets or heirlooms. But that's what the Ark of the Covenant was. It is a box or a chest. And in the Old Testament, there are multiple references to the Ark of the Covenant. If you have seen Indiana Jones and the Lost Ark, came back, was that in the 80s? and they had Steven Spielberg and others did a good job representing it. We don't know exactly how it looked because every single detail isn't listed, but you can still get pretty close to a description. It had the winged cherubs on the front facing each other, and it was very ornate, covered in gold. All this stuff is described in the Old Testament. And it had these two basically poles on the side for which people could be used to pick up. And this is very important because the ancient Israelites, almost certainly, we can't prove this, but it does make a lot of sense, that they got this idea from, or at least the tradition of using it, from the ancient Egyptians, because we know the Egyptians did this all the time. Egyptians loved religious festivals. There was no such thing as the weekend in the ancient world. What people did was work on various work cycles. The Egyptians seem to have worked on a 10-day work cycle, but they celebrated religious festivals all the time. So it was not uncommon at all to have days off during the week or during that 10-day cycle because you had to go celebrate a particular religious festival to the gods, or maybe even the king might declare some honor to him and so forth. So this was very common. Little footnote, when God tells Moses to go back and let his people go, and Moses goes and tells the Pharaoh, and Pharaoh just means the great house. It's like calling him the White House. It's not really his name. But anyway, he calls the main king of Egypt, the so-called the Pharaoh, let my people go and so forth, because I'm going to take them out to go celebrate a religious festival. It says that in Exodus. Well, that's very historically likely that someone would say that. That is to say, these Jewish slaves should have a break now to go to a religious festival. That would have been a very reasonable request of a religious leader to say it's time for their religious break. Of course, they make a break for it, and eventually. But anyway, okay, so they went on work cycles, religious festivals. At the religious festivals, they had all kinds of things they did, depending on the god or the goddess that they were worshiping. Egyptians really preferred to fashion their gods after animals, like jackals and snakes and so forth, which is quite different from the Greeks and Romans and really the Babylonians as well and others. They preferred human-like figures or figurines for their gods, but the Egyptians liked animals. And what they would do is take these basically portable thrones and put a little chair on it and put their god and make an idol, an image of the god, and put it on top of these things and walk around in a massive festival. A parade is what it was. They had a big religious festival. They'd have the priests do all kinds of stuff. They'd have dancers and singers and incantations and prayers and partying and feasting, and depending on the god, maybe wild orgies and stuff. It just depends on what they thought the god demanded or the gods demanded. And then that was the party time. Well, the Ark of the Covenant, the box of the covenant, the chest of the covenant, looks quite similar to what we know of, the same things the Egyptians used. But there's one massive difference, a massive, massive difference, and that is, of course, the Ark of the Covenant had nothing on top of it. There was no idol, there was no image placed above it, because Jews were different. As far as we can tell in the ancient world, Jews were the only ancient people group who were what you call any kind of theist, any kind of belief in an all-powerful being, that did not make images of their God. In fact, according to Deuteronomy and some other places, it is prohibited. Well, that's very weird. And as far as I know of, it is absolutely unique. And I mean that word is what it means. Unique doesn't mean special. It means inimitable, without kind. So the Jews seem to have been unique in the ancient world to say you cannot make an image and it's different from just having a speaker say it. It seems to have been the case that Jews in general did not ever practice. They were iconoclasts. They never practiced making images of their gods. And it doesn't mean people didn't try to do it sometimes, like when Moses came down the mountain and he found they made a golden calf. But of course they made a golden calf. That's what they did in Egypt. That's where they just came from, and that's how they thought the gods would be happy by making them in the shape of different animals that they really valued, like the cow. But that ticks them off because God can't be made into images. Because that's the point is they are not making a graven image. It's not because God doesn't like a selfie. It's because it's the theology represented in an image. The image represented something that they thought they could do to the gods and for the gods so that the gods would do something back for them. You need to understand the ancient world, everybody believed that the relationship with the gods was reciprocal. It was reciprocal. It was not a love relationship. You didn't make covenants with the gods. With a people group, and I'm going there in a second, but the first point I'm making here is the image issue. The idols would have been worshipped and anointed with oil and rubbed and given food and water and all kinds of stuff. And the idea is that the gods would notice how well you're treating their image, their idol, and then they would be good to you. Well, it seems to have been the case. That's exactly what God did not want the Jews to think about who the real God is. The real God doesn't work that way. The real God is not manipulated. He can't be coerced or cajoled by oil and incantations and food and water and drink and roses. That's not how it works. So a striking difference in the box or chest of the covenant is that there's no image above God above it. Now, they still thought God resided on top of it to some degree, but he was not an image. And there's more there, but I mean, later on in Jewish theology it would develop, because like Isaiah, Isaiah says, God says, when he's talking about building the temple, and he says, earth is my throne, heaven is my throne, earth is my footstool. What house can you build for me that you reside there? The point is, I'm not squeezed into one spot per se. But anyway, that image, if you look at any Google image for Ark of the Covenant, you'll see usually a fairly good rendition of the description used in the Old Testament. So the first major distinction is that there's no image on top of it, even though it looks very similar to the Egyptian way of doing it. The second major difference is what's in it. What is in it? And what is in it is it's a depository for the tablets of the covenant. And the Decalogue, or the so-called Ten Commandments, was the basic covenant, but they would also might include other rules from Leviticus and Deuteronomy that would make up the various covenantal codes of the Old Testament, but particularly the Decalogue, or the so-called Ten Commandments. And we know that from the text it says there were 2 copies of it. And in most cartoons and movies and so forth, they have renditions where there are, in fact, 2 copies, one in left hand, one in right hand. But what everyone seems to get wrong is that there's 5 on one and 5 on the other. That's almost certainly not at all what the implication is by having 2 copies. There's 2 copies because you have a copy for the Israelites and a copy for God. It's a contract, it's a covenant where both copies are held together in a sacred spot called the chest of the covenant. In fact, that's why the second major distinction with the Egyptian is the issue of covenant. The Jews, secondly, my second major point is the Jews seem to have been unique in the ancient world to believe that the Creator God made a special contract with one people group and only one people group. And that's why the best analogy that there is, that I know of, is from the ancient prophets, which is God, as it were, married Israel. He's married. And the imagery constantly used of spousal relationship is a very good one. So when Israel worships other gods, they are adulterous. And if you know your Bible, that sounds kind of, oh, I get it, whatever. But in the Old Testament, the ancient world, that really stands out as a bizarre feature of the way ancient people considered their relationships with the gods. It was a novelty to think that there is one God, or even the chief God, who formed a quote-unquote marriage or covenant relationship exclusively with one people group. Other people didn't think that way. The gods could join any people group, any nation, any gender, any whatever, but that's not what the Jews believed. And this Ark of the Covenant is sacred because it holds the marriage contract. It's like having God and the Israel's wedding rings inside of this chest, inside of this box. And that's a big, big deal. So the 3 things, so that's the 2 distinctions of what it looked like and its function. In the Old Testament, to repeat some of this, but just to emphasize, in the Old Testament, there are 3 major purposes for this chest. But like only one of these is really distinct, and I already told you, but I'll just go this one more time. The first is, and the most important is, it was used as a depository for the tablets of the covenant. That's a real biggie, and that's unique in the ancient world. Secondly, it was and they said this, it was his footstool within the tent of meeting and within the temple. The tent of meeting is something like the tabernacle. Before there was you might say, brick and mortar temple, there was this makeshift tent that was used at different places at Shechem and other places where they were considered sacred spots that God would say, stop here, build this altar, and so forth. And they would bring in the Ark of the Covenant, and they used it and treated it as if it was God's footstool. That is to say, God's presence was right above it, and he was always present with the Ark of the Covenant, and therefore it made the place around it ritually holy and pure and so forth. So it was his quote-unquote footstool there, and then later on in the temple. And then thirdly, it was a conduit for Yahweh's presence in warfare, and that was quite common in the ancient world. Everybody believed that the gods were on their side, and everybody believed that the gods were going to help them beat up the other guy. Not every god had that function. Some gods had the god of fertility and so forth, didn't join you in war per se, but every culture seems to have had their army gods. And Baal, the storm god of the Canaanites, was one such god, and his lover Asherah. But Baal, or if you're from the south in the United States, you say Baal. But Baal was there for the Canaanites, and Baal's character shows up often in the Old Testament. Well, the ancient Israelites believed the same thing about their God. In fact, the imagery of the storm god, as was used of Baal, you can find in the Psalms at times, that God rides on the storm, some of the exact vocabulary used of the god Baal. And so it seems to have been the case that you have ancient people groups of the time in Egypt, Israel, Mesopotamia, borrowing similar vocabulary to speak about what their God can do, or their gods can do. And secondly, not only is that vocabulary similar, but the imagery and the iconographic use of various objects was also similar, and this ark is one of them. So it would not have been weird for the other army to show up with sacred chest or box, thinking that their god, but their god, of course, would be an image or idol above the ark, the box, and so forth, or some other sacred figure. Both sides of the armies almost certainly would have sacrificed animals in devotion to the gods, said various prayers, and asked the gods. And then whoever won the battle, they would have said, see, our God was on your side, our God beat up your God. And ancient Israelites are no different from that. They very much believe that when they went to battle, Yahweh was on their side, and Yahweh couldn't be stopped. And there's several stories of that in the Old Testament. Like, for ones, when the Ark of the Covenant is not there, they get creamed. But when the Ark of the Covenant is there, they don't get creamed, because Yahweh fights for them. So those are the three things chiefly in the Old Testament. The chest of the covenant for which it was used was a conduit of Yahweh's presence in warfare. It was so-called footstool within the tent of meeting, and then later on the temple. And third, and most importantly, it was a depository of the tablets of the covenant. And that's what it was used for. Well, back to the original question was, what happened to it? So what happened to the Ark of the Covenant? Well, the answer is, we don't know. We don't know. The last time the Ark of the Covenant is mentioned is in 2 Chronicles chapter 5. It was in Solomon's temple. And that's it. The next, a lot of scholars, I think it's safe to say most, and I'm one of them, but I mean, would have this view, though I'm sure I'm not a scholar, but they probably disappeared just before the Babylonian captivity, probably, which happened around the 6th century BC, so it's the late 500s. There's reference in the Old Testament that when the Babylonians came in, they robbed or stripped clean the temple and all of its sacred objects, all of its valuable objects. You can read about this in 2 Kings chapter 24, 2 Kings 24, 13 to 20. It says this, as the Lord had declared, Nebuchadnezzar removed the treasures from the temple of the Lord and from the royal palace, and cut up the gold articles that Solomon king of Israel had made for the temple of the Lord. He carried all Jerusalem into exile, all the officers and fighting men, all the skilled workers and artisans, a total of 10,000. Only the poorest people of the land were left. And that little reference to he removed the treasures from the temple of the Lord and cut up the gold articles, a lot of people think that's when the Ark of the Covenant was exiled. It was deported then when the Babylonians sieged Jerusalem. Early, if you don't know this, early on the Jerusalem leadership sided with Babylon against Egypt, but then they switched sides back to Egypt, became pro-Egyptian. When that happened, Nebuchadnezzar went crazy, and that's when he sieged Jerusalem in the late 500s, so late 6th century. But 2 Kings does not say, and they took out the Ark of the Covenant. And since it doesn't say that, we're not sure at all where the Ark of the Covenant is. My own opinion is, whatever it's worth is, I think it's very likely the Ark of the Covenant was in the temple. And my belief is that that is what happened, is that they took the Ark of the Covenant with them, not only because it's covered in gold, because it represents also that their gods beat them. And then what happened to it? Probably, if it did go back to Babylonian captivity, it was put in the treasury there, or it stayed in the Temple Mount and used as a sacred object until the Babylonians were destroyed, or it was melted down for gold because it had been very valuable. And they did things like that. They'd melt it down and turn it into jewelry and so forth. Now, Ethiopian Christians think they possess the Ark of the Covenant. Today, right now, Ethiopian Christians think they have it. the church called St. Mary of Zion Cathedral in Oxum, and you can go there today. There's a little area, you can get fairly close, I think, but it's guarded. But basically, no one thinks it's in there besides them. But they sure do. They think they are the covenant. I think it'd be pretty funny if they did have it. And all this time, I was like, they don't got it. And then one day they actually discover it was there all along. I think it'd be pretty cool. But anyway, they think they have it and say they have it. They're in Oxum. So if you want to take a bus trip, an airplane trip over there to Oxum, go check it out. See what you find. Let me know, because I will put you on the podcast. That's all for now. God bless you. See you next time. Thank you so much for listening to the podcast. I really do hope that you enjoyed it. I hope you'll listen more. If you want more, go to davidpendergrass.com. There are tabs at the top that let you have access to all the podcasts I've recorded, to sermons I've done, books I've written. They're all there at davidpendergrass.com. You can also check me out on Facebook, facebook.com/glimpse of the kingdom, facebook.com/glimpse of the kingdom, and also look at my Twitter feed at glimpse the kingdom. Or at Dr. D. Pendergrass, at Dr. D. Pendergrass. There's tons of ways reached out. I hope you will. Send me your questions, send me your comments. If you'd like to support the ministries of Glimpse of the Kingdom, you can also find ways to give online on davidpendergrass.com. If you'd like for me to come and do some consulting, check out my website, davidpendergrassconsulting.com, and I'll be happy to come out and speak to your organization and help and train any way I can. God bless you. See you online.